There are many mountains in the world that only the bravest men and women dare climb. But even among these, there are some peaks that are too challenging even for the most experienced of climbers. One of such mountains is Denali, formerly known as Mount McKinley. It's the highest mountain peak in North America and the deadliest. It doesn't seem that tall compared to, say, Everest, but an important distinction of Denali is that its foot is only 609 meters above sea level, meaning that to get to the summit, one has to climb 5,581 meters. This differs greatly from Everest. Its plateau is a whole 5,181 meters above sea level, with its first base camp only 3,500 meters away from the summit. Thus, if we calculate height from the foot of the mountain, Denali, located in the Alaska Range, is the second tallest peak in the world, surpassed only by Mauna Kea, most of which is submerged in the Pacific Ocean. Until 2015, Denali was known as Mount McKinley, named in 1897 after US presidential candidate William McKinley. He won the election only to be killed by his political opponents in 1901, but the peak with his name remained. In the language of Alaskan Native peoples, Denali means large mountain, or simply tall, a much more precise attribute than the name of the 25th US president. Evidently, in 2015, the US government decided so as well, restoring the mountain's original name after over 100 years. Much of the Alaska Range is made up of sedimentary shale, limestone, and sandstone that were formed 100 to 400 million years ago. A few peaks, however, Denali among them, arose from a younger granite intrusion about 35 million years old. Tectonic activity continues to lift the entire range at a rate of about 1 millimeter per year, even as wind, water, and ice erosion are chipping away at it. Its enduring gray-pink granite ensures that millions of years from now, Denali and its granite brethren will continue to rise while their neighbors turn to dust. Monthly rain and snowfall levels on Denali are colossal, making the mountain one of the greatest permanently snow-covered vertical landforms on Earth. Denali has long attracted both amateur and professional climbers, but nonetheless remained less popular than Mount Everest, Kilimanjaro, or Annapurna. The reason for this is the climate. Denali is much colder than the other great mountains, since these are located at latitudes with more favorable weather conditions, whereas Denali is very close to the North Pole with temperatures to match. Temperatures as low as minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit are not uncommon during blizzards. Making things even more challenging, Denali is situated next to the Gulf of Alaska, which adds humidity, low pressure, and snowstorms into the equation. It's also more challenging to reach the foot of Denali than that of Everest. Only the most experienced pilots can land a plane at Denali's base camp, and no Sherpas or mountain guides are around to help, meaning the climbers have to carry all their equipment by themselves. Avalanches and snowstorms that no tent can weather are commonplace. The hikers need not only to be physically trained and acclimatized, but also ready for extreme cold and constant changes in the weather. A sunny day can turn to a stormy one in a matter of hours. Only half of the hikers that start out from base camp tend to make it to the summit. Some turn back, others are less lucky. Only a few will return to the foot of the mountain alive. The most common causes of death here are falling into ice crevices, hypothermia, and avalanches. If there's an emergency, help is nowhere to be found, since no plane or helicopter can manage such an altitude through a snowstorm in time. You can only rely on yourself and your friends. Groups need to climb together, joined by one rope, so that if someone slips and falls into a crevice, the others can pull them out if they have the experience. Such incidents happen quite often on Denali, since the ice here is rather unstable. Climbing this peak without proper training and huge experience is pretty much equal to committing suicide. 24-year-old Joe Wilcox had, at his young age, already made about 50 ascents to mountains over 10,000 feet or 3,000 meters high when the idea of climbing Denali came to his mind. In the summer of 1966, the young mountaineer had a job in the U.S. Forest Service cutting down Sitka spruces on the islands in southeastern Alaska, and even though he had never seen Denali before, the mountain called him, as hikers say. Upon his return home to Utah, Joe started planning his trip back to Alaska for the summer of next year, 1967. He started looking for potential teammates at his alma mater, Brigham Young University, but nobody was particularly enthusiastic about climbing the deadly mountain. Even experienced climbers that Joe was acquainted with declined the invitation, one after another. Joe began thinking that he himself was the reason for this lack of interest, since he wasn't a very sociable student and often lacked tact and affability. Nonetheless, by November 1966, two people joined Wilcox's group, Jerry Clark and Mark McLaughlin. Jerry decided to help the young team leader with recruitment, so even though officially the climb was organized by Joe, most of the team members were unfamiliar with him, having been invited by Jerry Clark, who had been in mountaineering for 14 years. I was a bit uncomfortable leading an expedition composed largely of Jerry Clark's friends, but Jerry's complete cooperation and support was reassuring, Joe wrote. Joe didn't mind giving over the negotiations to Clark, himself concentrating on the technical preparations for the hike. On November 16, 1966, Wilcox sent out 14 copies of the expedition's newsletter to potential team members in 5 states, specifying the mandatory fee of $300. This equals to about $2,000 today. The fee covered food and group equipment, as well as transfers from Seattle to Alaska and back. For most of the young people interested in participating in the Wilcox expedition, this price was exorbitantly high, though nowadays it would probably seem like a very good deal, since modern climbers pay $6,000 to $8,000 for such an ascent. Although there was no official start date, the latter referred to a trial hike that was to take place on Mount Rainier, near Seattle, before they left for Alaska. The purpose of this hike was to get a feel for each other's abilities and characters before finally gathering at McGonigal Pass and heading up the Muldrow Glacier to Denali. Joe took the preparation process seriously. He wrote at least 20 memos detailing the future ascent and the team that was to make it. These also contained information on food supplies, a list of equipment, and advice on preparing the body and mind. Thus, to prepare the body, Joe recommended running, swimming, lifting weights, and carrying a heavy backpack for long distances. To prepare the mind, he required each member of the expedition to read the ABC of avalanche safety, the books Mountain World and The Freedom of the Hills, while he himself memorized Bradford Washburn's pamphlet titled Frostbite. There was a reason for choosing the latter work. Washburn had climbed Denali twice. He knew a lot about it and put many of those things into writing. Joe even wrote to Washburn to get permission for a light airplane to escort the group during the ascent. The overconfidence of the young group leader surprised Washburn. Not only did he not bless the expedition, but he even wrote a vitriolic letter to the U.S. Forest Service demanding that they reconsider letting newcomers climb the peak. In January 1967, Wilcox sent out a memo appointing Jerry Clark as deputy leader of the team and college professor Ansel Schiff, PhD, as deputy leader of the scientific support group. Thus, Joe confirmed that the purpose of the ascent was not only sports, but also research. Hank Janes, Dennis Luchterhunt, Mark McLaughlin, and Steve Taylor were also mentioned as members of the expedition. The names of Walt Taylor and John Russell were added later in blue ink next to those typed out. There were 5 other people on the list, but they dropped out of the project over the next few months for various reasons. Nevertheless, the core of the team had already been formed. As the summer of 1967 approached, Chief Ranger Art Hayes remained concerned about the lack of experience of some of the members of the Wilcox expedition. He had previously suggested that the group team up with another, smaller but stronger Colorado team consisting of Howard Snyder, Paul Schlichter, Jerry Lewis, and Lewis's younger brother, Steve. Both teams agreed to explore this idea, but no further. In a letter to Wilcox from May 10, 1967, Chief Ranger Hayes granted his request to head the expedition, but with some caveats. He required Joe to provide radios for the team, ordered experienced climbers to constantly supervise the less experienced, and made Wilcox promise to conduct intensive training for beginners on Mount Rainier, focusing on ice crevice rescue techniques. He also wanted to know to what extent the Wilcox and Colorado expeditions were prepared to cooperate. By May, the two groups agreed to pool resources, though without enthusiasm. The leader of the Colorado expedition, Howard Snyder, wrote to Jerry Clark, "It is my intention that we coordinate our efforts, not completely combine them." By the June training hike, there were 12 young people in Joe's group aged 22 to 31, none of them particularly experienced. They were Steve Taylor, Joe Wilcox, Howard Snyder, Dennis Luchterhund, Mark McLaughlin, Paul Schlichter, Jerry Clark, Jerry Lewis, Ansel Schiff, Hank Janes, John Russell, and Walt Taylor. Interestingly, the Colorado group had at one point nearly dropped out. A few hours before Joe's team were to set up for Rainier, Howard Snyder contacted them and said that Steve Lewis had an accident, breaking his arm and nose. With Steve incapacitated, the team would have to give up the idea of climbing Denali on their own, since the rules of the national park stated there had to be at least 4 people for a climb of such difficulty. The only way to get around this was to team up properly with Wilcox. In the words of Snyder, "We had to combine either with Wilcox expedition, or we had to abandon the hopes, plans, and expenditures of the past 2 years." The members of the Colorado group failed to see Steve's accident as an omen. The trial hike was to begin on June 11th. In the house where Joe's team had gathered, preparations were in full swing. Before setting out for Rainier, Jerry Clark and Hank Janes called to say that they would be late. Clark was working on the CB radios that they were to take them, while Janes was exchanging the tents they had rented. Meanwhile, there was no news at all from Walt Taylor. Wilcox and his 5 acolytes reached Mount Rainier National Park on the 10th of June. The Colorado group hadn't arrived yet. On the Nisqually Glacier, a man in white woolen trousers and suspenders, nose and lips smeared with sunscreen, caught up with them. This was Walt Taylor. After a rainy night on the glacier, the group, having trained a bit, returned to base camp. At some point, Dennis Luchterhund quietly told Wilcox he was leaving the expedition. "Why?" asked Wilcox. "I just don't feel good about it. I have a feeling there will be problems on the climb." They talked a little, but Luchterhund couldn't shake a feeling that something will go wrong. "Think it over," concluded Wilcox, presuming Luchterhund's decision was the effect of a couple of days at high altitudes. And here is how the first encounter of the heads of the two groups is described. They drove to the campsite where their first meeting was cordial but short. Wilcox didn't get out of his car while speaking to Howard Snyder, who felt that he was being surveyed like a Hong Kong tailor sizing up a customer. As Paul Schlichter, one of the Colorado climbers, recalls with a chuckle, the exchange was frosty. You've got 2 guys who were going to be leading expeditions, but now one is going to be somewhat the subordinate. Howard is somewhat strong-willed, and he wasn't looking forward to being in a subservient position. Frostily, Wilcox invited the three newcomers to the house in Puyallup to discuss their next steps. Jerry Clark and Hank Janes had arrived as well, and all 12 men gathered together for the first time. Of the members of the Wilcox team, Steve Taylor was the most concerned about the forthcoming mixing of participants and equipment, and opposed it vehemently. Joe Wilcox tried to gloss over the conflict by saying that some of Steve's arguments were sensible. Snyder, however, responded by describing them as inane and indicative of Steve Taylor's apparent lack of basic mountaineering knowledge. Late at night, the discussion finally ended. A formal written 11-point agreement was drawn up in which Wilcox was identified as leader of the group. It defined the responsibilities of its members and the sharing of expected costs. In the decades since Joe Wilcox and Howard Snyder signed the expedition agreement, the group's merger has been portrayed as forced upon them by the National Park Service. However, former Wonder Lake County Ranger Wayne Merry, the last NPS employee to see the climbers before their ascent, had stated unequivocally that Wilcox was under no obligation to accept anybody he didn't want on his team. After the discussions and the drafting of the agreement, the Colorado trio left Puyallup and headed for the hike's starting point. With Hank Janes behind the steering wheel and Luchterhand, McLaughlin and Clark as passengers in the Hank Mobile, the drive was quite relaxed as they chatted and told jokes. They knew each other rather well and had relied on each other during previous ascents. Mark McLaughlin was known for his smile and ability to see the funny side of any situation. By 24, the same age as Joe Wilcox, he had made a couple of attempts to graduate, first studying architecture and art and then geology at Oregon State University. However, it was in mountaineering that he found his passion, having conquered 17 peaks in Washington and Oregon, exploring the Olympic Mountains as well as several glaciers and ice falls. When it came to equipment, he knew what was needed, and if what the stores offered did not meet his expectations, he would make his own equipment. For instance, one of the tents the team was supposed to carry to Denali was McLaughlin's handiwork. Upon returning home, he planned to re-enroll at Oregon State University to continue studying. His close friend Jerry Clark was 7 years older than him, and unlike McLaughlin, excelled academically. He had already received a master's degree in geophysics, a PhD in psychology, and worked as an electrical engineer. Both were strong climbers, but had differing styles. McLaughlin was a more aggressive mountaineer than the 31-year-old Clark, who drew on 14 years of experience, and perhaps because of this, took a more conservative approach to climbing. Luchterhand, known to his friends as Denny, struggled to lounge around in the backseat of the Hank Mobile because of his height, 6'4". He had already received a BA in geology and was pursuing a master's degree. Denny intended to study ecology and wildlife conservation after climbing Denali. Hank Janes, the van driver, was a school teacher, a quiet and introverted young man. He believed in the healing power of the wilderness. During the summer, he ran a mountaineering program at a boys' camp. He did a lot of climbing in Colorado and in the Tetons. Janes dreamed of combining his love of nature with teaching. For example, by starting a camp of his own. I feel that I can be of more help to kids by working with them in an outdoor situation rather than in an academic atmosphere, helping them to develop an awareness of others and of themselves, helping them develop a sensitivity to nature and to leave. Eventually, I hope to start a camp of my own. In the other car drove Joe Wilcox, Steve Taylor, Walt Taylor, Ansel Schiff, and John Russell. They got to know each other along the way. Steve Taylor was a tall and skinny physics major. He met Joe Wilcox at Brigham Young, and it was Joe's tales of mountaineering that piqued Taylor's own interest. Soon thereafter, he joined the university's mountaineering club and started spending his weekends hiking, soon becoming an experienced climber. Steve also had experience with winter climbing and had worked with the club's rescue team. Nonetheless, he had no real experience in high-altitude climbing. He had been the first to join Wilcox's expedition. Walt Taylor was persuaded to go to Alaska from his native Indiana by Jerry Clark. I first learned to water ski with Jerry Clark. I first learned to snow ski with Jerry Clark. I first learned spelunking with Jerry Clark. I first learned scuba diving with Jerry Clark, Walt said. I learned to smoke and drink on my own. The quick-witted medical student had climbed the Rockies and the Tetons extensively and spent 3 summers as a technical climbing instructor in a Colorado mountaineering school. Here's how Taylor introduced himself to the team. I grew up in Indiana. I went to high school in Indiana. I went to college in Indiana. I have a burial plot reserved in Indiana. I plan to die elsewhere. Will the plans of these men come true? We'll see. Ansel Schiff, like Walt Taylor, was an associate of Clark's and lived in Indiana. He had recently completed his PhD in engineering seismology and was working as an assistant professor of engineering at Purdue University in Lafayette. He was pretty inexperienced in mountaineering. Schiff could only boast of hiking, camping, and scrambling as opposed to climbing. His mission, however, was to lead the scientific and support group, not to conquer the peak. John Russell, a stocky man with a mop of curly reddish hair and a matching beard, was the most enigmatic member of the group. By the age of 23, he had worked as a sheet metal journeyman, electronics assembler, calculator and editing machine repairman, taxi driver, gamekeeper, sandal maker, and lumberjack. He had studied mathematics, biology, chemistry, history, and philosophy, but never gotten a degree. He had also traveled throughout Europe and Central America. John's parents had not heard from their son for more than 4 years until on June 1st, 1967, he called and said he was going to climb Denali. How Russell learned about the expedition is unclear, but his addition to the team also came through Clark. Although none of the group had ever climbed with Russell, he had experience, fitness, and a desire to conquer the peak. The group's drive was not without trouble. As they entered Alaska, the car that Joe was driving broke down. The other man agreed to take their trailer in tow, and so they moved from their car into the Hankmobile, which suddenly seemed much smaller. When Schlichter first glimpsed Denali, his feelings were mixed. Looking at the peak, he thought, gee, maybe I'd be happier just taking this time and spending it in Colorado, climbing some of the 14ers there. There were several routes one could take to climb Denali. Joe's group chose a popular and relatively easy route along the Muldrow Glacier. By the time the men had decided to conquer Denali, only 213 people had ever reached its peak. For comparison, today the total number of those who attempted the ascent, not always successfully, exceeds 32,000. Back in the 60s and 70s, though mountaineering was gaining a lot of popularity as a sport, its rules were still being written, and often in blood, as climbers had to rely on their own instincts in planning the route, assessing the weather as well as their own strength. In the mountains, cooperation and mutual respect are very important. When someone new joins an established group, it takes time to build up a relationship. Thus, Wilcox's team, being rather mixed, erupted in conflict now and then, which could be potentially deadly given how challenging their hike was going to be. The reasons for the quarrels were understandable, of course. You have 12 young and ambitious men put together, with their leader only 24 years old. Besides, one shouldn't forget about the unpleasant companions of any ascent: mountain sickness, fatigue, injuries, and frostbite. Joe's style of leadership now seems overly soft compared to most modern-day ascents, where a professional guide has the final say in all decisions, from where to make camp and what to eat, to assessing the climber's fitness. The leader may send one of the group members back to the base camp for any reason, and this decision cannot be challenged. Nowadays, professional guides are responsible for the life and well-being of their clients. Then, the attitude was different. The climbers arrived at the foot of the mountain. The ascent did not begin immediately. After the first night at Wonder Lake, they had to first reach the glacier. Their equipment was carried partly by horses, partly by people. They planned to set up their first camp on the edge of the glacier. Already, Steve Taylor was suffering from mountain sickness at an altitude of only about 700 meters. Snyder described Steve Taylor's demeanor during the wait at Wonder Lake as that of a man in a continual state of depression, and believes that Taylor was terrified by the sight of the mountain, and it was literally worrying him sick. Schlichter agreed, saying, "I think psychologically he just wasn't ready for this expedition, and I'm not sure why he was there." Andy Hall later wrote in his book Denali's Howl. The first 5 days of their ascent brought damp weather. As his friends later recalled, Walt Taylor kept exclaiming angrily, "Come on, son, show us you haven't forgotten your chillin'." He also suggested walking around naked to showcase their belief in the sun god, but nobody accepted the offer. The next outburst of anger came from John Russell. He was dissatisfied with Clark and McLaughlin, who used their skis to get equipment and food, which Russell found to be unsafe. He also thought they were carrying too much gear and suggested leaving behind an extra stove, shovel handles, and saws. Leaving these things behind was a staggering mistake. Though it did result in lighter backpacks, the climbers lost the tools they needed for quickly building walls and snow shelters to protect them from deadly snowstorms. Meanwhile, Joe was always trying to gloss over any conflicts. "We had a couple of meetings where people aired out their grievances," said Wilcox. "There would be a discussion, not every day but at least every other day, on how things were going. Not on how to climb, the route, the camps. That was all worked out in advance. Still, some decisions fell to Wilcox alone. I had the last word, but if all were opposed to something, there was no sense in doing it." While Russell continued avoiding climbing with Clark because of the ski issue, Wilcox was reshuffling the rope teams to give everyone the opportunity to work with each other and complete different tasks necessary during the ascent, strengthening the spirit of companionship. Between camps 2 and 3, the group had several days of relative rest due to the danger of an avalanche. The forced respite was welcome. The men shoveled snow from around the camp and enjoyed snow fights. Wilcox and Steve Taylor played chess. Luke Turhan lamented the lack of women on the expedition. Janes read a book aloud. Soon the conversation turned to the Vietnam War. It wasn't until the beginning of July that the group finally set up Camp 3. It then turned out that Schiff was suffering from acute heartburn and could not eat either before or during strenuous activity. He was secretly taking a dozen antacid tablets a day, but the medication only masked a growing problem. Camp 4 was set up by the evening of July 4th, Independence Day. After a short period of calm, the conflicts resumed. Russell accused Schiff of carrying a smaller load than required. Walt Taylor tried to resolve the conflict. "In my mind, Walt was the most mature, had the best leadership qualities," Schlichter recalled. "He was a really good guy. He was a very straightforward guy," he said. "Ansel, you're not carrying the loads like the rest of us are. Don't try to fake it and pretend like you are. If you can't do it, that's okay. We understand that. We can help out." But there was something that friendly conversation couldn't cure: altitude sickness. The team began to climb at a much faster pace. This caused fatigue, which began to influence their decision-making. Altitude is the great equalizer. It treats both the strong and the weak with the same contempt. Headaches and vomiting are the most recognizable signs of altitude sickness. Other symptoms are less obvious: insomnia, dehydration, lack of appetite, and swollen hands and feet. Having overcome most of the route and reached Camp 6, the group began to discuss further actions. On Thursday, July 13th, after lunch, Joe Wilcox gathered several members of his team in the cook's tent to discuss plans for assaulting the summit. A weather forecast had come in from the Eielson Visitor Center. The conditions in the next 2 days were ideal for conquering the peak. "My feeling is that we should make a run for it," Wilcox announced. "All of us pack up 5 days of food to 18,000 feet and climb to the summit the following day." However, upon discussing the issue further, they decided to create another camp at 5,029 meters, 16,500 feet, and spend the night there for additional acclimatization. They decided that the Taylor brothers, Schiff and Russell, would stay at Camp 6 for one more day to pack enough food for 6 days and 10 people. 8 more people would climb to 5,486 meters, or 17,900 feet, each with a 4-day supply of food, and storm the summit on July 15th. The rest would attempt to climb the summit on Sunday, July 16th. The Colorado climbers ate in their own tent and did not participate in the meeting where these things were decided, but when Wilcox passed the plan over the wall of their tent, they agreed. On July 15th, there was another group on the slopes of Denali, in addition to Wilcox's Colorado team, a group that included Jeff Babcock, who set up for the peak with his 29-year-old brother, accepting his invitation to join this adventure. Bill Babcock's group devised a contingency plan to come to the aid of Wilcox's climbers if needed. Even before the Wilcox ascent started, Jeffrey suspected that in organizing this expedition, Joe had bitten off more than he could chew. Babcock understood the weaknesses of the expedition, which from the very beginning seemed obviously dangerous, though Babcock himself was only 19 at the time. And though he himself had never set foot on a glacier and didn't know how to pull a person out of an ice crevice, he readily admitted his weaknesses. Babcock was good at rock climbing, but Denali was all ice and wind crusts, and nonetheless he understood that Wilcox was way too sure of his success. Was it the zeitgeist, or was it just these men were especially fearless? But Jeffrey's father told him there was nothing to be afraid of and that he should climb the mountain to become a real man. Jeffrey's mother tried to dissuade him and never gave her blessing for the trip, but he didn't care. And there were many such overconfident, handsome, strong, and fearless young guys that were to be made into men by the mountain. Later, Jeffrey Babcock was the first to come to the aid of the Wilcox group, aid that they would be in dire need of. So, the group of 12 people decided not to storm the summit together. On the eve of an important stage of the expedition, a fire broke out in Wilcox's group. A faulty camp stove valve resulted in a tent burning down, along with Walt Taylor's parka and John Russell's sleeping bag. Schiff gave away his extra parka, and McLaughlin offered half of his 2-layer sleeping bag. Only a part of Wilcox's group, the 4 most prepared men, Wilcox himself, and 3 members from the Colorado team, moved out of the last camp on July 15th to storm the summit. After 27 days in the mountains, Wilcox realized that the so-called window of good weather could close as quickly as it had opened. The strange makeup of their team was practically accidental. When Wilcox left his tent at the appointed hour before the assault, he saw that only the men from the Colorado group were ready for the ascent. The rest refused to go that day. Some were tired, some were not feeling well. Schlechter and Snyder were the most experienced members of the team, so it wasn't surprising that they were the ones who went to the peak a day ahead of the rest. These two, having met in 1963, had already conquered mountains in Colorado and Mexico together. Perhaps it was this preparation that played a decisive role. The other members of the joint team had never climbed anything over 4,500 meters before going to Denali. In spite of the promise given to the chief ranger, the group became divided into stronger and weaker climbers. Paul Schlichter finds that at this point, Joe Wilcox should have demonstrated leadership qualities, and that this could have changed the way things played out. I think that was where Joe or somebody should have said, the weather is good. You're not going to get any rest by staying here at almost 18,000 feet for another day. You've got to decide whether you're going to come with us now, or it's probably smart to turn around and go back. But Wilcox didn't do this for different reasons, but mainly because he understood that the other team members probably wanted to climb with friends. They continued the ascent. I remember we got on that summit ridge and the weather was just beautiful, Paul Schlichter said. We were in short sleeves going to the summit. At 6:30 p.m., when the summit was already visible, Wilcox turned his radio mic on to inform the rangers of his group's whereabouts. The first sounds to be heard in that recording are the quick, short breaths of Wilcox, and then his question to one of his mates. How far now to the summit? 60 feet to the summit? This is followed by several more minutes of labored breathing and rambling, and then the voice of Ranger Haber comes in. Are you on the summit right now? Roger, all four of us. The ranger asked them to describe what they saw, and Howard Snyder answered, 4 acre is completely out of the clouds. The clouds are down about 11,000 feet, and it looks beautiful. All of the peaks off to, let's see what this would be, to the southeast. The peaks to the southeast are visible. The clouds are lying low in the valleys. It's just a beautiful view up here. The men spent an hour and a half on the summit, taking pictures, dictating postcard writings over the comms, lighting firecrackers, drinking coke that Joe had held onto for the grand moment. Right above the summit, there was the blue sky and the sun shone brightly. Nothing indicated the storm that awaited them on the way back to base camp. But the weather changed quickly, as is often the case in the mountains. Here's how Andy Hall describes it based on the recollections of his father, a Denali National Park ranger. A juggernaut was bearing down on the mountain. The meteorological forces that would clash were powerful but unremarkable individually. Only when they came together would their potential be released. The counterclockwise spinning low-pressure system was approaching from the north with its warm, moisture-laden winds. The big high-pressure system was still parked over the Alaska range. It's called dry air naturally rotating in the opposite direction. Soon, they would touch, rotating in tandem like cogs in a great weather machine, the air pouring from high to low and generating winds at the summit beyond imagining. Snyder, Schlichter, Lewis, and Wilcox started their descent back to the camp. Cirrus clouds covered the sun, and by the time they reached Denali Pass, the wind had grown stronger. Meanwhile, the rest of the group was only preparing to assault the peak, planning to set out the next day and trying not to notice the clouds brewing above their heads, a sure sign of an impending storm. Snow was already beginning to fall. Despite the bad weather, altitude sickness, humor was alive and well. Late at night, as they lay in their sleeping bags with the wind roaring and the nylon tents snapping in the breeze, Luchterhand let out a long, lonely howl, and soon the entire camp was howling along in lupine unison. On July 16th, a strong wind arose, and the remaining members of the team had to postpone their assault on the summit, waiting the fall weather out in their tents. In the morning of July 17th, everything in the camp seemed calm. The 4 conquerors of Denali decided to separate from the rest once again and begin the descent to Camp 6. They didn't see the point of spending more time at such an altitude, so once they rested a bit, they moved on. Fewer people in the upper camp meant more food and fuel for those who remained. Moreover, Jerry Lewis's condition continued to deteriorate, so the first priority was to bring him down to a lower altitude. Mountain sickness further undermined the health of John Russell. Whenever he tried to eat, he was sick. Snyder tried to talk to him into going down with them, but his offer only angered Russell. Meanwhile, the 30-year-old Ansel Schiff opted to descend. He had been suffering from altitude sickness for a long time and decided not to risk it. As it turned out, the decision would save his life. Joe Wilcox also seemed to be suffering from the adverse effects of high altitude. Both Howard Snyder and Paul Schlichter recalled him looking like he was suffering greatly. He was so damn sick before we came down that he didn't pack his own pack, Snyder said. His guys packed it for him. He had wanted to stay and support the second group that was to assault the peak, but Clark soothed him and convinced him to begin his descent. 10 minutes after they left, the remaining climbers were to start assaulting the peak. At least, that was the plan. Snyder, Schlichter, Lewis, Schiff, and Wilcox started their descent at around 1 p.m., occasionally glancing at the camp and the other team members. Time went by, they continued their descent, but the other group still didn't rope up and begin its route. At about 3 p.m., Wilcox and the 4 other climbers arrived at Camp 6, whereas above them, the assault on the peak had only just begun. Walt Taylor was laying the route across Harper Glacier to Denali Pass. 3 p.m. is pretty late for starting an ascent. In ideal conditions, it would take 6 hours, with at least 2 required to return to the tents. But in July, the days on Denali are long, with the sun setting at midnight and rising at 4 a.m. This lulled the inexperienced climbers into a false sense of security. As they were descending, moving further and further away from the camp, the climbers who had already conquered the summit could not even imagine that this was the last time they would see their friends. Jerry Clark, who had previously been on expeditions in Antarctica, led the second assault. The 23-year-old Steve Taylor decided to stay at the camp because his mountain sickness made it impossible for him to even move. As a result, 6 men set out for the summit. 5 hours after the start of the ascent, at 8:30 p.m., Clark contacted the park rangers by radio and informed them that he was somewhere high on the mountain, but didn't know exactly where because of a thick fog that had blocked their path. He added that the group decided to wait out the night at the peak, hoping the weather would improve, but they had little food, water, and only a few sleeping bags as they had planned to climb quickly and descend swiftly. At 11:30 a.m. on July 18th, Clark contacted the rangers again and reported that his group had reached the summit. The wind blew furiously into the microphone. Clark said they were planning to start their descent in 5 to 10 minutes and that only 5 people made it to the peak. John Russell, according to the rangers, had turned back before reaching the summit. Then Mark McLaughlin took over the radio.
Hey Gordy, you still sending postcards from the summit?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to send one to my parents. Do you have a pencil and paper there?
Go right ahead.
Mr. and Mrs. S.P. McLaughlin. Dear Mom and Dad, radio from the summit. I am okay. See you in a week or 2. Love, Mark.
Okay, got that. How about giving a little description of what you can see up there? Tell us how the view is right now.
The view consists of 4 other guys at the moment, that's all. It's completely whited out. We're sitting just below the summit. You can see the wands on the summit, that's all. Over.
Boy, you didn't luck out like the last 4, I guess. They got a real good view when they were up there. Do you mind naming off the people that are up there right now?
Sitting on the summit, Jerry Clark, Hank Janes, Dennis Luchterhand, Mark McLaughlin, and Walt Taylor. Wouldn't want to forget him. He led all the way up.
Okay. Say, when I talked to Joe last night, Wilcox, he was wondering what happened to the 7th man. He thought 7 were going to try for the peak, and I told him there were only 6. He'd like to know what happened to the 7th man. He doesn't know where he is. Do you?
7th man is Steve Taylor, and he didn't feel good at all, so he stayed in camp at 17-9. He's probably wondering where we are at the moment.
Okay, thanks for the call. Yeah, I can't read you very well at all anymore. You're fading out. Well, not fading out, but very indistinct. I think your batteries are going down too. We better clear for now. Just before you do cut out, What time do you want us to stand by here for the next call? Do you have any schedule that you want to maintain?
Just 8 o'clock, I guess.
Okay, 8 p.m. We'll have someone here then. He promised to contact them again at 8 p.m., but this didn't happen. Because as soon as their exchange ended, one of the most severe whiteouts in the history of Denali descended upon the mountain. A strong wind and heavy snowfall kept Wilcox, Schiff, Snyder, Schlichter, and Lewis in the camp at 15,100 feet, pent up in their tents, awaiting the next call session at 8 p.m. They expected to hear that their friends had reached the upper camp after conquering the summit. When the group didn't return at the appointed time, no one was especially worried. After all, given the grueling climb, who would blame them for collapsing straight into their tents after returning, not bothering to call back? Late that evening, Schiff interrupted the rambling discussion he and Wilcox were having inside the swaying, rattling nylon tent. "Listen," he said, "I hear voices." Wilcox poked his head out of the tent and into the driving snow, but, real or imagined, the faint sound was gone. Joe was worried. He wanted to return to the upper camp as soon as possible, but Snyder dissuaded him, suggesting that he do this once the weather calmed down a little. In the early morning of July 20th, the two men went up the trail, but soon turned back, realizing the storm and mountain sickness wouldn't have let them reach their destination safely. Strong winds continued throughout the night of Friday, July 21st. Suddenly, in the dead of night, the Colorado team was awakened from their restless sleep by voices outside the tent, calling for help. It was Schiff and Wilcox. Their tent had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and now the five men huddled together in the four-person tent. The next day, they finally started their descent. As members of another group, led by Babcock, were finishing their breakfast, one of its members saw someone coming down the mountain. "Hey, looky up there, up on the coxcomb. I see some climbers coming down. Must be those Wilcox guys." Johnny reached for his binoculars, stood up, and glassed the slope above. "Yeah, it's them, alright. But I only see 5. Something's wrong? They're moving awfully slow. Something doesn't seem quite right." The news caused a stir in the camp. "I think we'd better fill up our thermoses and get on up there. Find out what's going on. Something's not right." Wilcox was going in front. One of the members of the Babcock team ran up to them and asked, "Hey, everything okay?" "Hard to say, just tired, beat. We just want to get down. About had it." Wilcox was as black as night. His mates trudged after him silently, tired and grim. Once they got back to the camp and warmed up, a conversation about the rest of the climbers sparked up. "Have you heard anything from the others up top?" "Nope. Their last radio contact was made from the summit on the 18th, 5 days ago. That can't be good. We've been pinned down at 15-1. 4 of us made it up to the summit about a week ago. 2 days after, 5 of us came back down to our 15,100 camp to relay more supplies back up to 17,900. But then the weather went sour on us and we couldn't get back up to the high camp, so you don't really know where the other guys are. We figure there's at least one man, Steve Taylor, at the high camp. He was having problems with the altitude, so he finally decided to stay behind when the other 6 went for the summit. What about those guys? Does anyone have any idea what's going on with them?" "Not really. We figure there may be holed up somewhere in the snow cave. At least, that's what we were hoping for. 5 of them made it to the top. The 6th, probably John Russell, may have tried to get back down to 17,900. Don't know for sure though." Later, Joe contacted the Rangers and initiated a search operation for those who remained on the peak. As Howard Snyder was warming himself in the tent, he could neither eat nor drink, tears rolling down his face. He had the following conversation with Henry. "Pretty sorry state of affairs, huh? This whole thing is a nightmare. One hellish nightmare." Howard looked toward the entrance to the other tent and pointed an accusing finger in Joe Wilcox's direction. "And it's all because of that ass. Sometime later, before going to bed, Snyder suddenly erupted in an endless recapitulation of all the wrong decisions and conflicts that the group had during their climb. The storm dragged on. On July 25th, Schlichter, Snyder, Lewis, Wilcox, and Schiff returned to base camp. Babcock's group also fled from the storm, but they managed to build an igloo, which protected them from the wind and retained heat. They, unlike the Wilcox group, had saws and a shovel. Other men on the team dug trenches in the snow where they hid from the storm. Time went by, but the rest of the Wilcox team was nowhere to be seen. So what happened at the summit during the storm, and where were the rest of the expedition? After the weather finally improved, the Babcock group set out to look for Wilcox's teammates. They no longer hoped to find them alive, but it wasn't easy to find the bodies either. They found 3 men frozen to death, but couldn't identify them. Survivors believe that the 2 bodies belonged to Taylor and Luchterhand, the strongest and hardiest of the entire group. 2 bodies were found lower than the others. They may have started descending with the last ounce of their strength and died later than the rest. Bill Babcock discovered what looked like a makeshift tent. It was a structure that Mark McLaughlin had built, and it stretched strangely in the wind. Here's how Bill described what he saw. A ghastly sight, a man sitting upright alongside a Logan tent. Face and hands are blue, green, white, frozen yet decomposing. The frozen man was wearing orange clothes. His face was covered in snow. He was blown over, but during the storm he was holding the pole. One of the search team members recalls. The tent had probably ripped apart and the sleeping bag had blown away, and he was there holding the pole, and he obviously froze to death. Gail Nienhuser did not look closely at the body, though he took a photo of the tent-shrouded figure. Memories haunt him to this day, 45 years later. I was 26, Nienhuser recalls. I had never seen a body before. The hand that was exposed was black, and it had frozen and thawed a couple of times. I wasn't feeling good, and the smell. However, the horrendous state of the climber's body didn't necessarily mean he died a painful death. Hypothermia can be a relatively peaceful and painless way to die. Hypothermia is the most common cause of death in such cases and can be divided into 3 stages. At stage 1, the core body temperature drops 1 to 2 degrees Celsius below normal. There is a slight trembling, and the person soon finds that they're unable to perform complex tasks with their hands, as they quickly become numb. The blood vessels in the extremities become constricted. Often a person starts feeling like they've warmed up, but in fact, this means they're approaching stage 2. At stage 2, body temperature drops by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius. The trembling becomes stronger. Muscle coordination becomes noticeably impaired. Movements are slow and labored, often accompanied by a stumbling step and slight confusion. And the person may appear watchful and alert. Superficial blood vessels constrict even more as the body focuses its remaining resources on keeping vital organs warm. The person becomes pallid. Their lips, ears, fingers, and toes may turn blue. At stage 3, body temperature drops to around 32 degrees Celsius. The shaking usually stops. Speaking becomes difficult. Amnesia may set in. Cellular metabolic processes stop. Below 30 degrees Celsius, exposed skin becomes blue and swollen. Muscle coordination is very poor, and the person starts exhibiting irrational behavior. For example, they might try to burrow into the ground or fall into a stupor. Heart and respiration rates drop severely, though sometimes the heartbeat can be rapid. In the final stage, major organs begin to fail, eventually resulting in death. The third body was most likely that of John Russell, whom the other members of the group lost along the way. He was found next to their last camp. Perhaps he had managed to reach it when the storm descended upon the area. Steve Taylor's belongings were also found. Because of altitude sickness, he had remained in their last camp instead of attempting the final assault. Perhaps when he saw the storm, he tried to descend, but fell through the ice or got caught in an avalanche. As for the other members of the expedition, their bodies were never found, and no one dared bring the discovered bodies down. It would be simply impossible. Jeff Babcock still regrets that he didn't take photographs when he found the dead. Perhaps their friends could have identified them by their clothes. When rescuers went up the mountain again, the bodies had already disappeared under a thick layer of snow and ice taken by the mountain forever. What events, besides the weather, could have led to this tragedy? According to the recollections of survivors, one of the reasons could have been a conflict which led to the group splitting into several parts and adopting the motto, "each man for himself." Snyder suggests that the storm came at a moment when the group was at the very summit or close to it, making the descent impossible in such conditions. There were many speculations as to who was to blame for the tragedy. Some criticized the rescuers for allegedly working too slowly, as well as for forcing two unfamiliar groups to work together, which was bound to lead to disagreements. Joe Wilcox's behavior also raises certain questions. It's often said that the leader of the group, not unlike the captain of a ship, mustn't descend until the rest of the team has done so. And Joe Wilcox, of course, blamed himself for what had happened. The mountaineering community accused him of being an inexperienced leader and driving his group to certain death. The tragedy became a disaster of nearly national scale, with the whole of the US shocked by the deaths of 7 strong, healthy young men. Everyone was trying to identify the culprits, and all the surviving members of the team, as well as those involved in the rescue operation, had their own version of events and thoughts about how the disaster could have been prevented. Here's an interesting exchange that occurred many years later between Joe Wilcox and Brett Washburn, who, as you remember, had ridiculed the young men's plan to conquer Denali. They met each other at the Mazama Club's annual mountaineering symposium in 1998. Brett briskly walked up to Joe, as he was often known to do with other associates and friends. Brett was always a man of action. He reached out his hand in a stilted, yet sincere manner, which Joe thought was going to be a perfunctory acknowledgement of his overall slideshow presentation. Instead, Brett Washburn looked Wilcox in the eye and said, unabashedly, "Joe, under the circumstances you did everything in your power to deal with that horrific event." That was it. Yet to Joe, it was enough. Joe was stunned and replied, "Thank you, Dr. Washburn." The controversy about the group's actions in bad weather was soon clarified by 2 experiments independently conducted by the National Weather Service and the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research. They concluded that even if the group had the latest technology and were caught in such a storm now, their chances of surviving would be as slim as on that ill-fated day. The weather was to blame, and perhaps their late start at the final ascent. Yes, there were conflicts, but in such circumstances, they would have arisen in any group. In the end, after many years, Jeffrey Babcock admitted that he could not have changed anything. Even the group's poor training most likely didn't matter. The storm was too long, too cold, and too terrible anyway. To this day, this ascent remains the worst tragedy in the history of Denali mountaineering. Nevertheless, Schlichter and Snyder managed eventually to come to terms with what had happened. Perhaps, if they had turned back once the altitude sickness set in, all the members of the team would have survived. Maybe if the second group hadn't set out for the summit so late, they would have had enough time to return. But turning back in the mountains is difficult. There it is, the peak, so close. How do you turn back when the journey to it was so difficult? Since 1937, Denali has claimed the lives of 123 people. The surviving participants in the 1967 disaster wrote books about it, each with his own version of events. Write in the comments what you think about this story and how it made you feel. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share the link with your friends. Subscribe to my channel and ring the bell. Stay safe.